hand over to you, Joe, if you want to start off.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the books? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the book!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You Book Club. Today we are closing out our conversation on When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. We've had 2 episodes previously on this book where we've gone through the whole history of the New Deal era and all the government programs that were stood up in the early 20th century through the mid-20th century. Last episode we talked about rules for work, divisions in war, and white veterans only. The sort of main chunk of the book where Ira Katznelson is outlining how the government colluded to use these programs, Social Security, the GI Bill, benefits for veterans, mortgage assistance, etc., all these things to exclusively benefit white people and exclusively, this is redundant, exclusively exclude black people. I suggested the title of When Affirmative Action Was Anti-Black to sort of pick up on this theme of how it was deliberately used to punish and keep black people stuck in poverty. And we talked about how these generations have changed over time, of how we as white guys in the 21st century are the beneficiaries of this generational transfer of wealth that did not benefit people of color. And so today we're kind of closing out this whole book, discussing Katznelson's final chapter where he offers some of his thoughts on renewing affirmative action. He has some ideas about what can be done now. I think this book was published in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. So this is like early 21st century solutions before the 2008 financial crisis, before the Trump era. And so maybe we have some thoughts about how times have changed even since he recommended these things that would be helpful for us to talk about. By the way, are you guys aware that like once July hit, we're closer to 2050 than we are to 2000? Has that really sunk home with you guys that we're no longer the beginning of the 21st century?
I don't think so. I don't
Scary.
I'm not, yeah. I'm unhappy that you shared that fact with me.
Time keeps on slipping, man. It's crazy. Yeah, I have some moments I highlighted from this last chapter that we could talk about, but just kind of want to toss it to you guys. Do you have any quotes or moments from this final chapter that stood out to you that you want to bring up and discuss for a minute?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I think the one that I'll read off just because you mentioned it up front and this kind of ties into it just a little bit. We don't have to spend a ton of time on this one, but you mentioned this was like 2005. And so, what's changed since then? And I just wanted to read one quote. I think this was the start of, I think, section 4 on page 166. And so the way that this starts off is it says, then at the helm of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Clarence Thomas argued in 1987 that the legal debate over affirmative action is behind us. That same year, the eminent legal scholar Herman Schwartz estimated that the affirmative action wars are over. And he said, we know, of course, they were both wrong. And it just made me think about 2005 compared to where we are now and like the current conflict against anything diversity, anything, equal opportunity or anything like that. Like, I guess it just made me think what's changed. It's like they couldn't be more wrong. Like with those predictions than as we've seen it play out since then. But yeah, I had a couple more, but that was the first one that kind of popped to mind when you said that.
That's funny. I chose the quote directly above that on 166, and I thought it really stuck out with me because it captured the argument of the book. And Katznelson writes, although the gap in education and earnings between whites and blacks has steadily closed for the top third of African Americans, the median income of the great majority of blacks lags behind that of whites by about 1/3. And the figures of family wealth are even more unequal, not only in home ownership, but in other assets such as stock holdings, savings accounts, and retirement funds. This gap in net worth grew substantially in the 1990s with the run-up in value of real estate and stocks. The old advantages and disadvantages have continued to compound. It summarized it really well. And in terms of being written before, like 2005, before the financial crash, before the billionaire explosion of the 2010s and 20s, it's like Katznelson is clearly laying out the warning signs. And the same dynamics continue to exist. Billionaires have multiplied. The housing market's become like an investment scheme. And the importance here is that if we don't name the racial capitalism and how it works, not just historically, but like structurally, we just keep mistaking the inequality that exists for accident instead of what it is. And it's actually designed in the system.
Yeah, this is like a recurring, never-ending thing in capitalism. Is there are always these schemes going on. I don't know, like rich people are so good at finding ways to make more money, of manipulating the economy to do. And Bitcoin is like the most recent, or crypto in general is the most recent example of how they're doing that financially and how much of a scam that is in a large way. Any moment where someone's like, oh, all this stuff is behind us, we don't have to worry about that anymore, we're past that. Like, no, it's not how it works. And to your point, Cody, things have changed even since 2005. And you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and this sort of anti-woke reaction against it. It seems like the extremes continue to grow together. Like, there is more awareness of how people have been discriminated against. There's more awareness of changes that need to be made to make the society more fair for everybody. And at the same time, there's more of a strong reaction against that. And both of those things get heightened simultaneously. It's like in Marxist terms, they call that like heightening contradictions. Like the contradictions that are obvious within a society just become more and more apparent as time goes on, and they inevitably come to a clash. And hopefully there's no violence, but that's usually when wars break out, is when you can't resolve them through the normal legal means. And we see this now with all the legal precedents just starting to break down. When we do our core episode, I'm sure we'll talk about all the terrible things that are going on now, but like you just see people depending less and less on the slow legal process to solve things and more on, what, screw it, what can we do now with these two hands to take care of it?
I think, Joe, you were talking about how it's just continued to kind of expand. The divisions have continued to get magnified on this issue, I guess. But I think one of the things that stuck out to me, too, there was a paragraph in here on page 150 that kind of plays into this. It's really talking about how proponents of affirmative action, like the story behind that and like the clear messaging around it, or that it was non-existent compared to like the opponents and like their arguments against affirmative action. So I just kind of want to read through this paragraph because I think it also plays into what we were just talking about there. Though affirmative action's opponents have failed to eliminate race-conscious programs, they have succeeded in occupying the high ground of colorblind equality. Unfortunately, the arguments and rhetoric these adversaries have fashioned have not been countered by equally clear and defensible principles, except for broad claims to the compensation for generalized history of slavery, segregation, and other forms of racism in American history. Defenders of affirmative action typically argue with a body of principled reasoning appreciably less developed than that of the opposition. The theory under which affirmative action is justified is often not articulated. That was Jack Greenberg, the former director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, has remarked, "Indeed, advocates do not define any supporting theory at all. The respected journalist Nicholas Lehman has observed that while the opponents of affirmative action have been honing their argument for a good 30 years, arrayed against these compelling arguments is a very loud silence. Perhaps because proponents of affirmative action have been unable to persuade most white Americans that it's a good idea, they have mainly relied on decisions in executive agencies and courts, usually skipping the effort to win broad support either in public opinion or in Congress. So down through the decades, Lehman judged, the muscles that liberals would have used to make a public case for affirmative action have atrophied, and the conservatives were becoming magnificently buffed and toned." So I felt like that whole paragraph just kind of like encapsulated a lot of the arguments in general, like that we've been talking about, right? Since the Civil Rights Act and whatnot, like the opponents of that, and like they're trying to roll it back. Have just had like 30, well now at this point, what, 50 years almost of just work on the messaging and the rhetoric and ways to kind of like tear it down and attack it essentially. And I guess the argument that's being made is like those that should be defending it and trying to create the rhetoric or the argument against that have failed to do so in a way that's convincing and just kind of relied on executive action to push these things through, which I think has like the backfire effect, right? Of like, it's just like people feel like they're just being forced to do something without understanding like it in that scenario. So it could actually have the opposite effect of what they're trying to do is kind of where my head was going with that.
Yeah, I think that echoes a lot of general comments we've been making on the podcast a lot. I know I brought it up before just in terms of combating fascist propaganda. Is it's not enough just to point out that it's insane or that it's racist or that it's unhinged. Like, you have to have an equally compelling argument that goes the other way, that convinces people that generosity and community care and mutual taking care of each other are better values than competition and profit motive and things like that. Yeah, this is sort of to that point. Like, you have to make the case. You have to have a compelling argument to make. I think my read on this chapter in general is that Katznelson was kind of almost pessimistic about ways to support something like reparations or things to any broad, sweeping, grand gestures to try to correct some of these historical injustices. It just seemed like he didn't have a lot of optimism in that direction, and I found that kind of a letdown given the context of the whole book, which I think is such a great explanation of all of the terrible ways the government has abused these systems throughout the 20th century. You've mentioned before, Cody, just trying to get back to a basic conversation about shared values, about what we can do as a society, what values we can really organize around that lead in a good direction. On page 171, he gives a few solutions or I guess policy suggestions that he's offering here. There are three. I'll just read these in the middle of 171 that Katznelson offers. I guess I'll read a couple of sentences before to sort of set it up. Popular and political support, in short, as well as judicial legitimacy, will depend on the clarity and persuasiveness of the association between harms and remedies. One of two approaches is possible. In the first, a closely targeted program of corrective justice would search for identifiable individuals who have been harmed even at the distance of 1 or 2 generations. By the pattern of exclusions and local administration, this book has documented. This policy could yield both tangible and symbolic compensation. As examples, for the lag in entering the Social Security system, the excluded could be identified and they or their heirs could be offered one-time grants that would have to be paid into designated retirement funds. For the absence of access to the minimum wage, tax credits to an equivalent of the average loss could be tendered. For the lack of access to key programs under the GI Bill, programs of subsidized mortgages, small business loans, and educational grants could now be put in place. So those are some of the policy solutions he offers, and I don't necessarily have any issues with those as examples of things that could be done. My main thought here is that they're all tied to this assumption that everyone is involved in the economy, and that everyone has some access to a job, some access to the prospect of a mortgage or, the idea of a small business loan, and that just straight up generosity is not a consideration here. It's tied to some mechanism of the economy. It's taken care of through your tax write-offs. It's taken care of through a small business you try to set up. You have to wait until you retire to actually get this grant. Slavery and Jim Crow and these things are not that far behind us. If you think of an elderly, unhoused black person today whose father was a sharecropper, whose grandfather was born into slavery, or whose great-grandfather was born into slavery, that's only 2 or 3 generations. What are any of these solutions doing for those kind of people who are just totally kicked out of the system altogether and who are just living on the street and have no help whatsoever? You know what I mean? I guess that's my main frustration with these sort of bureaucratic solutions to things like that. Whereas a simple generosity, a transfer of wealth with no strings attached, would upset people, but it would also take care of people. I don't know, I'm not maybe making a useful alternative suggestion here, but I'm just pointing out a frustration I have with this approach he's taken to the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
What I was thinking, Joe, is it's like these solutions are solutions aimed at providing opportunities for people, not restitution, is kind of the way that I read it or kind of looked at it. It was like, I think his thought on reparations is like, just, well, I can't remember the exact line, but it was like reparations are not like enough, or it's like it's too broad to be able to, do that just because of general slavery or whatnot. Like, he was very specific, like we need to be able to track back who was actually impacted. I mean, where my head goes to that is like, that's going to take a massive effort to just get the analysis and what organization is going to do that. And then I'm sure there's probably like, oh my gosh, like the government's going through genealogy now. But anyway, all that aside, like, and what that's going to spin up. Yeah, it just seemed like it was more focused on opportunity versus restitution, and I feel like that's just a very American way to look at things. The rhetoric around America being a meritocracy and like, oh, if you work hard and you get the opportunity, everyone starts at the same place, right? Like, that's what I felt. It's like trying to get people closer to the same starting point to where they can participate, but not focused on actually making up for the atrocities, right, of the past, if that makes any sense.
Definitely. I think that, like, I guess my takeaway was that after reading this, affirmative action, it's not a handout, it's like a partial repayment. And some of these things that he's suggesting definitely are partial repayments. But I think that you can't shy away from the state-sponsored policies. All these policies are like, I don't know, like what AOC kind of says sometimes is that like policies are moral documents, and what we fund and who we protect and what we choose to enforce, they're all political choices. And some of these things of like, having compensation and stuff, I think they don't really go far enough. It's like no one's going to disrupt the system. Like you say, Joe, with like wealth redistribution, like, yeah, it would make a lot of people unhappy. But I think putting in like tax codes and one-time payments to retirement funds, it's like kind of hoping that the system is going to solve the system's problems. And it's just like the wheel. So yeah, it definitely needs to go further. And I don't know, even today, it's just like really sad how we look upon DEI or affirmative action and we're just like totally stripping it and looking at it as fraud or waste and abuse or whatever the new, nomenclature they have is.
Yeah, and I think honestly, it distracts us from the handouts that the ruling class gives itself all the time. Part of this book, in a big way, was about how the policies in the New Deal era were behind the scenes manipulated to become handouts for plantation owners in the South, essentially, between the rules for work and agricultural workers and home like maids and things like that. Capitalists wanted to continue to exploit black labor. And a lot of these policies made that continue to happen well through the 20th century. And it was sort of the language around it was the propaganda that justified it. It made it seem like, oh, we're helping working people. Like, a lot of white people got benefits from these programs and were able to increase their family wealth. And that's what it became about. And it distracted from the actual transfer of wealth that was continuing to happen through the exploitation of labor, which is what capitalism is the exploitation of human labor power. I think I heard someone summarize the whole exploitation angle of capitalism in a nice way recently. They said basically it's like you work 8 hours, you get paid for 3 hours. So you work 8 hours, you get paid for 3. Your boss gets paid for 5, and he can do this because he owns resources that were taken by violence in the past. And that's essentially what capitalism, and that relationship continues to exploit us every single day, and it's still happening. All of this stuff about getting people up, all of these narrative campaigns that the right wing engages in, and they're very good at it, of convincing people to be upset about any so-called handout to any group that's been disadvantaged, distracts the population from the ongoing exploitation that the ruling class is doing against all human laborers everywhere. I kind of just want to shift the conversation back to the exploitation that the ruling class is doing to everybody, especially black and brown people, but also to poor white people all over the place, right? Yeah, that's, I think, where narratively we need to be more focused. And I think that's why they maybe hesitate to embrace some sweeping policy that would really look at the exploitation that's going on, because they would discover, oh, we actually, yeah, we owe reparations to people who are descendants of slaves. We also owe reparations to indigenous people. We also owe reparations to the historical working class in general. And so it'll just snowball into all of these things coming out into the open that they really, really don't want to become obvious to the public.
They don't even pay their taxes. They're not going to pay the minimal tax that we agreed to today.
Yeah. Are we kind of just doing wrap-ups on the book and our overall thoughts? Or okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Because what I was thinking, Joe, as you were kind of talking through that, something that this book helped me understand, and one thing that I would, a reason that I would recommend people to read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you've spent more time like actually going through whatever critical race theory courses are, but it felt like this is kind of like what that is. It's like looking at history through the lens of how it treated Black people, right? Like with all of these policies and whatnot. But the reason I say it's probably a good thing to read is because it shows you a lot of the tools that people in places of power used in order to selectively enforce or, enforce the portions of policies that they wanted to, right? Like, so it's one thing there that it shows you that. And it also really does help lay out that picture, Joe, that you're talking about, where it's looking at people as resources and not as people. And I think that translates across. Like, it doesn't matter, like in this scenario, yes, it was exploitation of Black people and trying to make sure that they could continue to do that. But the same tools would be used if the opportunity arose. And it also helped explain, at least to me, why critical race theory is the boogeyman, right? Like why they don't want anyone studying that or thinking about that is because like, oh, wait, there's more than just history here. But like that really came through to me, if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah. And like, I did a PhD in English literature, so it's not like we studied all of critical race theory or anything, but there's like a mandatory class in critical theory, and critical theory in academia in general is just philosophy aimed at critiquing the structures of society, of understanding how large social systems work, and especially in understanding how they produce suffering and exploitation. And I think, Arthur, you have some thinkers lined up for the core episode that are well within this tradition of critical theory in general. The critical race theory is just zooming in on how race as a construct gets used to produce suffering and exploitation on a large social scale. And so, yeah, they don't want people learning about that because it will point out all the bad things that they're doing. And by they, I mean the ruling class and the large systems that they control. So, yeah, I think the main, if you really want to get into critical race theory, maybe we should add it to our book list at some point, because I think I read excerpts from this book in grad school, but it's been a long time and it would be good to read the whole book. But Frantz Fanon, the book is called The Wretched of the Earth, and that's probably one that we should look into if we want to dig into that angle of critical race theory.
I like your quote. I was thinking of the quote, I guess, of Carolyn Levitt, who recently said something like, we don't need more LGBTQIA majors from Harvard. We need more electricians and plumbers, which I think kind of highlights your point, because critical race theory, often whenever I studied like more leftist leaning politics, it always aligns with that. And it's like the same thing. It's like the teachings against the non-normative, whatever. And so definitely you get to see like the other and how people get screwed over. I really loved this book because like it showed that overall, like the white middle class was built on government intervention, and Black exclusion, I think, like to what you're both saying, is done on purpose. It's policy. And this book kind of opened up my eyes when I first did some readings from it. And I don't know, I guess like I was born into the empire of the US and never really thought about it. And, it was like one of the first books that revealed the curtain behind some of these intentional policies that seem really bad for good reason. And so, yeah, I love it. And I think we just need more policies of the same scale and force in the opposite direction.
Yeah. One of the things that, especially from a propaganda point of view, that I really appreciate about this book, like, you can have whatever takeaways you want about the book in general, but just reading through it as like a historical document. Katznelson is a very meticulous researcher. He does such a good job going into the details of all of these policies, how they were argued in Congress, how they were set up, how they were controlled at the state level, who the key players were in manipulating all this throughout the whole process. And so bureaucracy as an idea of, complicated mechanisms of government. Oh, they're too big, they're too complicated to understand. Don't even bother trying to wrap your head around them. He really walks you through the whole process so you feel like you get some grasp of how the bureaucracy works. And so you see from a propaganda point of view how those complicated systems within the government combined with some vague language on the public-facing level about meritocracy, about all the New Deal language that was public-facing, all the things they said to the public that they were going to do. Those two things combined camouflage the cruelty that goes on behind the scenes of capitalists working with their buddies in government to make sure that they still get the good end of the deal. They got assurances from people in government, the Southern capitalists did, that nothing was going to affect their bottom line. Right, but they were still going to continue to exploit black labor in the agricultural work, in the home care work, and all of this is going on under the guise of some generous public policy that's supposed to help people. So that's like the most insidious part about propaganda, and I think this book does a great job, as you're saying, Arthur, just sort of pulling back the curtain and showing you what's really going on here.
I would say too, Arthur, you mentioned how like it built the white middle class, like these policies helped to build the white middle class. So another takeaway from this is the government can implement policies that improve the lives of working people. Like it can be done because it has been done before. It benefited like the white middle class specifically in this scenario, but it does have an example of, policy put in place that helps the majority of Americans, right? If it's administered correctly and not administered in this patchwork way where it's like, the whole states' rights piece there, states can decide how to administer federal policy. But I don't know. I think that's another takeaway from this too. Like it's not impossible to create good policy that improves the lives of people.
Totally. Yeah. And even in recent times, like, I was complaining about what I might call means-tested solutions to things. People have to prove that they deserve a benefit, and then they apply for it, and then they wait for it, and then maybe they get it. And there's that whole process. But then during COVID, we all got checks, right? So it's like they can do it. They can cut a check when they need to cut a check. How do we apply the right pressure in the right way to get them to redistribute the wealth to the people who are suffering and who could really benefit from it?
Yeah, and I know there's like at any time you say redistribute wealth, like people freak out about that. But I mean, like what we're really talking about is like, why don't we just take our tax brackets and system back to what it looked like in the 1960s, right? Like, why is our top corporate tax rate so low compared to what it was then? Like, if people want this idealized version of a world where we've got a strong middle class, then we had a model in the past where we had taxes that supported that kind of vision. So what we're saying isn't something new, I guess is what I'm saying.
Definitely. They were under like more centrist Democrats too, like in political party. I saw Oliver Stone had the Untold History of the United States, which I don't know if you guys have seen the documentary series. It's pretty cool. It's like major events that have shaped the United States and the world today, and then kind of looking at them through a different lens of like propaganda and stuff. And he talks about the tax rates, how much higher they were too. And even now, like I read one thing, like the SALT tax, like the state and local tax thing, it used to be like a $10,000 deduction. And now it's going to be like 40,000 to 80,000 up to like 2030. Like they're building like a ramp to like give themselves less and less taxes each year that this goes on too. It's totally screwed up.
Yeah. And like what you were saying, Cody, about the reaction people have about the language of redistributing wealth, that reaction is like a social condition that the propagandists have tried really hard and achieved. Because the redistribution of wealth is always happening. It's still happening. It's not like wealth isn't being redistributed. Like the relationship of capitalism is a constant redistribution of wealth extracted from human labor to owners who control the resources. Like that relationship is a constant ongoing process of taking value produced by human labor away from the humans who produce it and giving it in the form of money to the people who own everything. That's always happening, still is, hasn't stopped. And so they want people to react against any language of redistributing wealth to distract from the fact that they're still doing it. Right? Does that make sense? Like first of all, can we stop that from happening? And can we have a conversation about how to share resources equitably in a way that everybody has what they need and we're not destroying the planet that we all depend on?
Yeah. So like in that scenario, I'm just using this as an example, but like if you've got $1 billion company that has 1,000 employees, then in theory, like each one of them should be $1 million a year, right? Like, is that kind of like what we're saying? And instead, it's like you might get 100,000, 120,000 for an employee, and then 50 million for like a CEO or like the board and shareholders. Like, that's kind of what you're saying. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, every work situation is different and everything is quantified in a slightly different way. But I always find it helpful. I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe I can just use myself, because I've done this with my students before. When I was teaching a chapter from the book I mentioned in one of our last episodes by Wendy Brown, Undoing the Demo, she has a chapter called Educating Human Capital. I think you had alluded to the fact that human beings are seen as resources to be used, and the term human capital is sort of in the world these days. And so I would explain to my students, and like, I'm very grateful to work at the University of Delaware. They pay higher than most other universities for their adjuncts, so I'm not complaining about my pay or anything. I'm just using this as an example to explain how the exploitation works, or as a worker, of one way you can calculate your rate of exploitation. You can think about the service you provide. So I'm a teacher. I provide the service of teaching. And what are the so-called customers paying for that service, right? So I would take the 22 students I have in class. Let's say 2/3 of them are in-state tuition, 1/3 of them are out-of-state tuition. I would tally up the per credit hour rate that they're paying for their tuition, right? And when I tally all that up for my one class, they're paying collectively, something like over $100,000 for that one class. Now, what do I need to provide that service? I need an internet connection. I need a laptop. I need access to some library resources. But other than that, it's not much, right? And then when I tell them how much I get paid, which is not $100,000 for that one class, I don't know specifically off the top of my head what it is this year, but it's somewhere around $6,000 for one semester of one class. And I point out the gap between what they're giving the university financially with their money and what I'm getting by providing the service. Where's all that other money go? If they're having $94,000 scooped off the top of what these students are paying for that class, why? What is that for? Who does that benefit? And then you get into conversations about administrative bloat, of how there are all of these administrators in the university making hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, all the ties they have to tech companies and research firms. You can see with the Israel-Palestine stuff, all the college students protesting their university's investment in Israeli military tech. And so a lot of people make the point that modern universities are more like hedge funds that have a side hustle in education. Right? They kind of provide education as a side hustle, but what they're really doing is using their resources to invest strategically and to try to grow their, what's it called? I lost the term off the top of my head. Endowment. It has an endowment. I think Delaware's is like 3 or 4 billion now. Is pretty big. But other universities are much bigger than that. You can look at like Columbia, I'm sure, is like a huge endowment. But they're used like hedge funds, essentially. They invest strategically, and the more money that they can use, the more industries they can influence. So anyway, the whole point was that as a worker, if you can sort of quantify your situation, you can calculate your rate of exploitation. If you're a subway worker and you make, I don't know, my first official job was at a Subway and I made like $5.05 an hour. Right? If I work an 8-hour shift and I make 100 sandwiches or something. Each sandwich costs like $6 or whatever it is. I can add all that up and then I can compare it to how much I made. You know, you can start to get a sense of how much they're scooping off the top of your labor.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I was thinking from like a tech perspective, like if you're, I don't know, a product manager for a specific product and that product is, making millions of dollars in sales every year, right? Like there's a lot of infrastructure that goes into that, right? Like the salespeople that actually get the contracts, all that. But you could probably do something pretty similar as far as what you've done to get that product to market in the first place. And then like, what are you as the person that's helping to create that software getting versus like your VP that is like the one that oversees it? Because like that's really the level where you start to see profit sharing occurs. Like once you're vice president or corporate vice president or something like that, then you get part of the profit of whatever your product is in some of these companies. So like that's where millionaires are created essentially once you get to that spot.
So yeah, that's When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. I highly recommend that book. I think my main takeaway, other than the bureaucracy and the vague language thing, is that the government will ignore and or embolden racism if it helps capitalism and the capitalists that they like. So again, this idea of neoliberalism, that the profit motive is the highest priority within the society. Even people with good intentions get pressured by the system, right? Even if you want to be a good capitalist, you still have to compete with the bad capitalists, and you get pressured to do things that are not great for the benefit of carrying on the system. So, yeah, I don't know. Read this book. It'll frustrate you and challenge you in good and productive ways, and then you can come to your own conclusions. But I think you'll feel like you've grown in a good way after doing that work.
Joe, on what you said there, it's like, I think like a modern example of that basically, just looking at profit overall is really in the, like just the AI race right now. Like we know what it's doing from a like damaging ecological standpoint, right? We know that it requires massive amounts of power. And like 50% of people that are involved in AI development are like, yeah, if we actually get there, there's a good chance that this could annihilate the human race. And yet we continue like to just march along this like road towards this thing, because there's also a 50% chance that it could be like, oh, we now have like a utopia of endless resources, but for 1% of the people or something like that.
I think it's a good take, and it just made me think about the problem that Grok exemplifies, right? Like you can have an AI that does what it's supposed to do, that is smart, that will give you good answers. And then if the person who controls it decides they don't like the answers it's giving, let's hit the Nazi button, make it Nazi.
Oh, man. Honestly, I'm almost grateful to Elon because it's really easy to see, it's easy to watch this, but if there was someone that was a bit more controlled on the back end, it'd be much more subtle. And that might be happening with some of the other platforms. We just don't notice it because it is subtle, right? Like, but yeah, Elon, not subtle.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's like Peter Thiel and Elon. Like Peter Thiel's like perfect background. Like you don't even know the guy exists in life, but Elon is just in your face, dumb.
Yeah. There's an interview with Peter Thiel I saw on Reddit where someone was like, do you think the human like race should survive? Or and he was like, just a super long pause, like, well, it's
That
a
guy
really
is-
interesting question.
He's surprisingly bad in interviews.
Yeah.
Like I've seen a handful of his interviews, and he sweats and struggles and can't articulate a thought. And it's like, I think part of his strength is just hiding
Yeah.
and not being in public view very often. He does not do well in interviews.
Yeah, agreed. But it is nice that a lot of times I think we've got like the vague, like they are doing this or the like this ruling class group, but now there's names to it, right? Like it's
Yeah,
pretty
definitely.
clear who those people are. Like it's like they can't really hide like they used to be able to, I assume.
I was just going to plug the next book for when we continue the book club. I hope you all enjoyed our conversations on When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. Please join us when we continue the book club, where we will be diving into a book called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, co-written by David Graeber and David Wengrow. David Graeber passed away right around the time it was published. Really good. I've listened to it on tape one time before, and it really stuck with me a lot, and I'm excited to actually read it with you guys and to have some good conversations about it. I think it'll give us an opportunity to kind of zoom back out from all the specific horrible things that are happening right now in the 21st century, or even the things that were happening in the past century, and really look at humanity as a whole. Who are we as a species? Where have we come from? What are all the things that we're capable of? And I hope that it will just sort of inspire us to have a bigger perspective and to sort of look at the world through a bigger lens. So I'm excited about that. Hope you guys stick with us.
And Joe, can people follow along while you're reading the book on Twitch?
Yeah, I will try to continue my Twitch reading of the book unless I get a cease and desist from the publishers, which hopefully they won't do because it's a good book and more people deserve to hear it however they can get it. But yeah, I'll be live reading on Twitch. I don't want to commit to a specific schedule because my work schedule is going to be kind of all over the place in the near future, so I'm just going to get to it when I can. But if you subscribe to our Twitch channel, Propaganda Loves You, you should get updates whenever a new video is posted. You can, if you don't get to it when I do it live, you can watch it for at least a week before it goes away on Twitch.
Awesome.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.